I'm an American who spent 14 months living in the Netherlands. And one of my biggest culture shocks while living in the Netherlands was seeing that a lot of Dutch people work part time. And as someone who really values my leisure time, I want to know how Dutch people are able to do that. Bearing that in mind, in this video, we will be reacting to a video about how the Netherlands accidentally moved to a 4-day week.
Earlier this year, Eurostat published data on the average working week across the EU for 2024. Like with most Eurostat releases, no one really noticed, but there was a pretty interesting number in there, 32.1, which is apparently how many hours the average Dutch person works, by far the lowest in the EU, and essentially equivalent to a 4-day week.
So he said by far the lowest in the EU. And in my personal experience, I did notice that Dutch people didn't seem to work crazy long hours like you see some Americans working. So again, I want to know how this is possible. Because I know that across the EU, generally work-life balance is valued much more than in the US, but it seems like even by EU standards, the Netherlands is super far ahead.
So in this video, we're going to explain how the Netherlands accidentally moved to a 4-day week, and why it looks like it's working pretty well. The first thing to say is that this didn't happen suddenly. Rather, it's the culmination of a long-running trend that apparently started sometime in the mid-80s. Before then, the Dutch were about as likely as anyone else to work part-time, with about 6% of working men and 22% of working women in part-time employment. But by 1990, this figure had risen to 15% for men and 36% for women, and by 1996 it had risen to 16% for men, the highest figure in the OECD, and 38% for women, behind Sweden and the UK, but well above the OECD average. So what happened in the 80s to provoke this shift? Well, broadly speaking, there were two factors at play. First, Dutch unions accepted a reduction in working hours for their membership to cope with the economic downturn that hit Europe in the 70s and early 80s. This wasn't the case in most other European countries, where, generally speaking, unions instead tried to protect as many full-time jobs as they could, even if that meant more redundancies. This was largely because the Dutch economy, and especially Dutch industry, had a particularly rough time in the 70s and early 80s.
So the sense that I'm getting is that they decided that part-time work is better than no work at all. And it's better to have a large swath of people working part-time than to have a small portion of people working full-time and a large portion of people who are broke.
Quite a lot of this has to do with a phenomenon that's since become known as Dutch disease. In short, the Netherlands began producing and exporting lots of natural gas in the mid-70s, when energy prices were rising worldwide. While this was great news for anyone in the gas industry, it was bad news for anyone employed in basically any other industry. Strong gas exports put upwards pressure on the Dutch currency, the guilder, which made the Netherlands' other exports uncompetitive, leading to widespread bankruptcies and job losses. The Netherlands then suffered a particularly brutal recession in the early 80s, with GDP contracting for 8 consecutive quarters between 1981 and 1983. With exports collapsing and the domestic economy in the doldrums, Dutch unions accepted that they needed to do something drastic. In November 1982, as part of the so-called Wassenaar Agreement with Ruud Lubber's new right-wing government, the unions agreed to both lower wages and accept fewer working hours in order to keep Dutch industry afloat. This worked remarkably well, and in the subsequent economic boom, a lot of the new jobs created were part-time.
So what I want to know is, if you were alive during that time, and especially if you were a working adult during that time in the Netherlands, how did you feel about that at that time? So not how you feel about it now, because I'm assuming that a lot of Dutch people have a pretty favorable opinion about this in this day and age. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but when it first happened, when these changes were being made, how did you feel about it in real time?
The second factor was the entrance of women into the Dutch workforce. For a whole load of complicated cultural reasons, women moved into the workforce remarkably late in the Netherlands. But the rise of part-time jobs in the 80s acted as a sort of release valve, allowing women.
What exactly were those cultural reasons he is referring to? Because it's my understanding that the Netherlands is one of the most progressive countries in the world, if not the most socially progressive country in the world. But I also know that it wasn't until sometime in the 1990s that they eradicated this. I don't really know exactly what you would call it, but it was kind of like a domestic housework type of class for women only. Correct me if I'm wrong about when they eradicated that, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing to have, but I think making it exclusive to women is definitely not the greatest indication of a progressive society. But again, the Netherlands, in pretty much every other aspect that I'm aware of when it comes to, let's say, for example, gay marriage or the legalization or I guess tolerance of marijuana, has pretty much been ahead of most of the other countries in the world in this regard. So it's kind of surprising to hear that.
Women with children or other caring responsibilities to flood into the labour market. The transformation was pretty astonishing. In the 70s, the female labour participation rate in the Netherlands was less than 30%, the lowest in the OECD. But by the 90s, it had risen to over 50%, well above the OECD average. You get the idea. The Dutch shift to part-time work apparently began in the 80s, with both a supply-side element, in other words, a rise in part-time job creation after the unions accepted a reduction in working hours, and a demand-side element. In other words, there were lots of unemployed but well-educated Dutch women who were ready for part-time work. This seemed to work remarkably well. The Dutch economy boomed throughout the 80s and 90s, with strong GDP growth, low unemployment, and balanced budgets. It was at about this time that economists started talking about the Dutch 1.5 earner model to describe households where one partner worked full-time and the other worked part-time.
That is a very interesting concept that I'm sure is a lot more common these days. I wouldn't necessarily know because in my whole adult life, I've pretty much always been self-employed. So I'm kind of in a gray area as far as part-time or full-time. But I do feel like, at least in the US, it's much more common for both to be full-time workers or for the household to be single income. I feel like it's fairly rare to have a situation where one person works part-time and the other person works full-time. Granted, that's just my own anecdotal observation. The statistics might not back my observation up, but I do feel like that is a big difference in the general working culture.
A consensus quickly developed amongst the Dutch political class that this 1.5 earner model was working pretty well, not least because of its dramatic effect on overall employment. And in the 90s, a series of new laws were passed to make it easier for part-time workers. In 1993, a new law extended the minimum wage, which was previously restricted to those working at least 13 hours a week, to all part-time workers. And in 1994, another law obliged employers to include part-time employees in pension schemes.
So this is kind of off topic, but another culture shock that I had in regards to work in the Netherlands is the age-specific minimum wages. That blew my mind. And then I think the minimum working age is actually lower. I want to say you can start working at 15 legally in the Netherlands, whereas in the US, in most places, you have to be 16 unless you're working under the table. So a lot of times at the grocery stores in the Netherlands, instead of seeing adults working there, you will see literal children. I'm talking about kids who haven't even really hit puberty yet. And that just blew my mind, going to Albert Heijn and Jumbo and seeing that.
In 1996, the Dutch Parliament passed the Working Hours Act, which included a provision obligating employers to consider the care duties of employees, essentially making it easier for full-time employees to move to part-time work. And in 2000, they passed the Part-Time Employment Act as part of the Framework Work and Care Act, which gave employees the right to change their working hours. Finally, this was updated in 2016 by the Flexible Working Act, which gives employees the right to adjust not just their hours, but also when and where they work.
That right there is key. And I've talked about this in prior videos, but a big part of why I really resisted the whole 9-to-5 lifestyle, or I guess in the Netherlands, it would be more like 9-to-3 lifestyle. But a big part of the reason why I resisted that coming out of high school was because of the lack of flexibility that jobs often provide. So it's really nice to see that there's at least one country out there that is putting policy in place to ensure that workers have more freedom and flexibility.
This legislation turbocharged the pre-existing trend towards part-time employment, which is why the Netherlands has had the highest incidence of part-time employment in the developed world for years now. For context, according to World Bank data, in 2023, over 60% of Dutch employees worked part-time, compared to an average of 31% in the OECD and 36% in the EU.
So what I want to know also is the standard for full-time employment is 40 hours a week, correct? Because I know for sure in the US that is the standard. I remember when I worked at part-time jobs when I was a teenager, we had a limit on how many hours we could work because if we became full-time, then they had to supply us with benefits and things of that nature.
Part-time work is still far more common with women, but Dutch men are also still more likely than any of their international peers to work part-time. This is the main reason that, on average, the Dutch work such short weeks, with the latest Eurostat data finding that the average Dutch work week comes in at just 32 hours, the lowest in the EU by quite some distance, and well below the EU average of 36 hours. Of course, this number is brought down by all the part-time workers. It doesn't mean, for instance, that everyone is working 4 8-hour days, but as part-time work has become ever more popular in the Netherlands, 4-day weeks have indeed become very common. So, how's this working out for them? Well, to be honest, it looks like it's going pretty great. The Netherlands has a remarkably high employment rate. According to OECD data, 82% of working-age people in the Netherlands were in employment at the end of 2024, compared with 75% in the UK and 69% in France. Nor does this seem to have hurt the Dutch economy. The Netherlands is an incredibly rich country, measured by GDP per capita, largely because Dutch workers are quite literally some of the most productive in the world.
Okay, so this right here, I love this point because I think a lot of Americans and maybe even in some Asian cultures as well, they like to equate less work or fewer working hours with less productivity. And in my experience, especially in my entrepreneurial endeavors, that is most certainly not the case. It's all about what you can do in the time allotted. And time again, I'm seeing studies that show that Dutch people are a lot more efficient within the hours that they work. And I'm a big proponent of the 80-20 rule. Generally speaking, if you're focusing on the 20% of things that are generating 80% of the results in any arena of life, you are going to be able to maximize your allotted time. And by extension, you can then minimize the time overall.
Which might have something to do with the fact that they're not as burnt out as the rest of us. And finally, families seem to appreciate it. Dutch kids are quite literally the happiest in the world, presumably.
Another thing I want to add to what he just said there about Dutch people being less burned out than other nations is that when Dutch people do get burned out, I've noticed that there is a very great support system in place for helping those people recover from burnout. In fact, until I went to the Netherlands, I didn't know that burnout was actually considered a real condition that people struggle with. I always saw it as more of a conceptual thing or an emotion that you experience within a certain period of time. But no, Dutch people treat burnout with the same degree of care as one would treat anxiety or depression. These are actual conditions that need to be addressed in a methodical way.